Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The first thing I noticed was the goddamn balloons, blue, white, and gold, floating up against the ceiling tiles like they were trying to escape the whole situation. Somebody had taped a sign over the banquet room entrance at Murphy's Grill that read, "Congratulations, David," in thick block letters. There were platters of overcooked chicken, lukewarm green beans, and some kind of casserole that I think had Ritz crackers on top. The kind of food you serve not because anyone actually wants it, but because tradition says you have to. That summed up the party pretty well, if I'm being honest. Carol had insisted on throwing something, small but meaningful. She said it was important to mark the end of an era, to gather everyone together and celebrate what I'd built. I spent 42 years designing bridges and roads for the city, structures that hold weight, that people rely on. I've missed Christmas mornings, birthdays, hell, even a couple anniversaries. But I did what I had to do. For the family. Always for the family. There were maybe 30 people in the room. Co-workers I barely knew outside of conference calls and mandatory safety meetings. A couple of my golf buddies. My daughters, Angela and Gina. Well, Angela was there. Gina wasn't. She hadn't shown up to anything family-related in over 5 years, and honestly, I didn't blame her. But that's another story. Then there was Brad. My son-in-law. 35, still wearing sneakers to formal events, still calling himself a tech entrepreneur despite never actually launching anything beyond an Instagram page and a half-baked podcast. He was the kind of guy who thought charisma could cover up competence. And for a while, maybe it did. He had that stupid confident grin plastered on his face, the one that always made me want to punch a wall, but I smiled back. It was my retirement party, after all. Angela leaned over during dinner and told me Brad had prepared a little speech. Her voice had that hopeful edge, like she was trying to convince herself it wouldn't be awful. I nodded and took another sip of my watered-down scotch. My hands were steady, but my jaw clenched just a little tighter. When the time came, Carol clinked her glass with a spoon, like people do in the movies, and the room fell into a loose hush. She said a few words about my work ethic, my dedication, how she couldn't have done it without me, though we both knew she had. I gave her a tight smile and a quick nod. Then Angela stood, holding her phone like she'd forgotten how to speak without a screen in her hand. She teared up a bit, real tears, I think, talking about how I'd always been there, always showed up, even when I probably shouldn't have. That one stung more than it should have. Then came Brad. He stood up, glass in hand, shirt untucked, no notes, just vibes, as the kids say. Well, he began, drawing out the word like he was stretching his ego across the room. What can I say about David? He chuckled, looked around for validation. Got it, too. A few polite chuckles. I stayed still. I mean, the man worked 40-something years designing concrete stuff, right? More laughter. Like roads and bridges and, I dunno, sidewalks. Another laugh. Bigger this time. I felt my grip tighten around the base of my glass. But hey, he did it, Brad went on, and now he gets to sit back, relax, maybe finally learn how to work an iPhone. He paused for effect, then raised his glass a little higher. So here's to David. May you enjoy being completely, utterly, 100% useless. The room erupted. Laughter bounced off the walls. Real, loud, belly laughter. Not polite. Not restrained. Even Carol chuckled nervously, like she wasn't sure whether to join in or scold him. Angela's smile froze on her face, the way it always did when Brad did something just a little too much. Brad beamed like a damn game show host. I didn't laugh. Not a sound. I stood slowly, raised my glass high enough to quiet the room without saying a word. They noticed. That silence settled fast. I looked Brad in the eye, then swept my gaze across the room. I forced a smile. Not warm, not cold, just calm. To your future, I said, then drank. They clapped, awkwardly, unsure if I was in on the joke or not. I didn't give them a hint. I set my glass down, nodded at Carol, and whispered that I was going to the restroom. I walked out through the side hall, past the bathroom, past the kitchen, out the back door, into the night air that smelled like cheap booze and regret. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the house, changed into something more comfortable, and went straight to my study, the room nobody enters except me. The room Brad once called my man cave, like I was some Neanderthal hiding from relevance. I turned the key in the lock, stepped inside, and closed the door behind me. Then I locked it. The sound echoed in the quiet, like a door closing on an old chapter. I walked over to the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a thick envelope labeled, "In case they ever forget who I am." They forgot. But I didn't. And now? Now I remember everything. The next morning the house was still, the kind of heavy quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from the weight of something unspoken pressing down on every room like dust on an old photo album no one dares open. Carol had gone out early for her walking group, still pretending like the party had gone well, still pretending like her husband hadn't sat through his own funeral with a smile frozen to his face and a slow-burning fire eating away at his gut. I stayed in bed a little longer, not out of tiredness, but out of something deeper, something like mourning but sharper, like a blade wrapped in memory. Eventually, I got up, brewed coffee the way I always do, black, strong, no sugar, and stood at the kitchen window watching the oak tree in the backyard shake slightly in the morning wind. The same tree I planted when Angela was born, back when I thought family meant building something that lasted longer than you did. The irony didn't hit me until I realized I was looking at a tree that had more stability than my relationships. I went back to the study, unlocked the door, and stepped in like I was entering a different version of my life. I turned on the lamp, sat at the desk, and reached into the bottom drawer where I kept the envelope. Thick. Yellowed. A label across the front in my own handwriting, black ink, slightly faded over the years. It read, "In case I ever matter again." That was my version of a middle finger to time itself, because the truth is, people only matter when others think they're useful. And I was tired of being seen as expired inventory. I slit the envelope open with my old pocket knife, the same one my father gave me the day I left for college, and started pulling out the contents slowly, methodically. Inside were papers, stapled packets, a few old manila folders, and one sleek black USB drive that looked entirely out of place. I laid it all out across the desk like a surgeon preparing for something delicate and irreversible. I started with the first folder, Loan Agreement. B. Mason. Dated 6 years ago. I remembered the day perfectly. Brad had come to me with that smug urgency of a man who thinks his ideas are worth more than your experience. Said he had a can't-miss opportunity, something about flipping domain names or building an app that matched dog owners with dog walkers who had similar vibes. He needed $30,000 to get it off the ground. I didn't laugh. I listened, nodded, and told him I'd support him as family. But what he didn't realize was that I never, not once, said it was a gift. I drew up the paperwork myself. I had Carol sign as witness. We even notarized it through a friend at the bank. He signed the agreement without reading it, too eager, too arrogant to check. Brad always thought charm could replace caution, but paper doesn't give a damn about charisma. The loan had very specific terms, including a clause that secured it against their property, which was jointly owned but structured through a trust I'd created for Angela. One missed payment wouldn't trigger anything but a pattern? That would. And Brad had missed 7 months. No payments. No calls. No acknowledgement. Just silence wrapped in that same smile he wore at my retirement party. Later that evening, after dinner and the usual quiet conversation that only pretends to be connection, I sat in the living room while Carol watched some HGTV show about renovating cabins. I pulled out my phone, opened Instagram, and saw the video Brad had posted. The caption read, "When your FIL retires and you officially become the alpha." Over it played a short clip of him raising his glass and laughing with a group of younger guests, none of whom had known me longer than a beer. I turned the volume off. Just watched. No reaction. No blink. Just stared at that grin stretched across his face like it had never known consequence. And that was when I said to myself, enough. Let me pause here and tell you something stupid I realized. I built that house in 2010. That's nearly 25 years ago. Seems wild, right? But here we are. Funny how time moves faster when you're not paying attention. Anyway, I stood up, walked back into the study, plugged in the USB, and pulled up the file directory. Dozens of folders, contracts, correspondence, financial records, even screenshots of texts Brad probably thought disappeared into the void. I'd been keeping receipts long before it was trendy. I selected 3 files, attached them to an email, and wrote a short message to my lawyer, Ronald Mendez, the only man I trusted outside my family, and even that trust had limits. The subject line read, "Next steps, per our last conversation." I hit send at exactly 2 in the morning. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I remembered who the hell I was. Exactly 1 week after that mess of a retirement party, 1 week of silence, of passive glances and tiptoeing around conversations that everyone knew were hanging there, but no one had the guts to touch. Brad's phone rang at 11 in the morning while he was sitting at his favorite corner table in a co-working space he didn't actually pay for. He always liked to sit there, with his laptop open and his AirPods in, pretending to be in high-level meetings, speaking just loud enough so strangers around him might think he was someone worth knowing. But that morning, when the name Ronald Mendez popped up on the screen, he didn't know who the hell it was. Not yet. Brad answered with the kind of tone he saved for potential investors or LinkedIn recruiters, all shallow warmth and forced ease. "Brad Mason speaking," he said, leaning back like he'd just closed $1 million deal. There was a pause on the other end, that kind of deliberate silence that tells you immediately this isn't someone who gives a damn about your posturing. Then Ronald's voice came through, measured, crisp, and without apology. "Mr. Mason, this is Ronald Mendez, attorney representing David Walker," he said, his voice as calm as a man ordering breakfast. "I'm calling regarding the defaulted loan agreement dated June 14, 2019, under which you received $30,000 from Mr. Walker, secured against the property you co-own with Angela Mason." Brad blinked. The sentence didn't make sense to him, not because he didn't understand the words, but because the meaning crashed straight through his carefully constructed delusions like a wrecking ball through a glass wall. Wait, what?" he said, sitting upright now, laptop forgotten. That wasn't a loan. That was a family gift. He said he believed in me." Ronald didn't flinch. "The documents are clear and notarized. Payment has not been received for the past 13 months, which places you in breach of the agreement. As such, Mr. Walker is within his legal rights to pursue recovery through the collateral outlined in the contract, namely, your residence at 117 Brookdale Lane." The blood drained from Brad's face so fast you'd think someone had pulled the plug on his brain. "You're saying he can take the house?" "Our house." Ronald exhaled slowly, with the kind of patience reserved for parents explaining basic math to stubborn children. "Not immediately. But foreclosure proceedings are now viable. You should seek independent counsel." Brad didn't say goodbye. He just hung up and stared at his phone like it had betrayed him, like the call itself was a glitch in the universe. His hands shook as he stuffed his laptop into his bag and bolted out of the building, barely noticing the young woman at the next table who gave him a look like she'd just realized her idol had feet made of clay. By the time Brad got home, Angela was in the kitchen, sorting through bills and humming to herself. She looked up and smiled until she saw his face. "What happened?" she asked, stepping toward him, worry already lining her voice. "Brad, what's wrong?" He tried to spin it, of course. Tried to frame it like a misunderstanding, some kind of clerical error. But Angela's face changed the moment she realized he was stammering. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just went quiet. And that quiet hurt more than anything, You told me he gave you that money, she said slowly, her voice thin as wire. You swore there were no strings. There weren't. I mean, not really. I didn't even read. He stopped himself, realizing too late how that sounded. Angela turned away, her shoulders tense, her hands gripping the back of the chair, like she needed something to hold on to or else she might fly apart. You didn't read the contract? She whispered. You signed a legal document tying our house to your startup and didn't bother to read it? Brad tried to close the distance, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away like his skin was poison. He's bluffing, Brad muttered, almost to himself. It's Dad. He wouldn't do this. And that's when David walked into the room. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He just opened the door with a key he still had and stepped in like he owned the place because, legally speaking, he sort of did. He looked at them both, his eyes tired but clear. I told you I was toasting to your future, he said, setting down a manila folder on the counter without ceremony. I never said it'd be a good one. Neither of them said a word as he turned and walked out again, closing the door behind him with the kind of finality that doesn't come from anger, but from certainty. Brad stood frozen, mouth half open, looking at the folder like it might bite him. Angela didn't move either, except for the slow shake of her head, one part disbelief, one part recognition. Because in that moment, she finally understood something Brad never had. David Walker might have retired from his job, but he sure as hell hadn't retired from being the man who made things happen. It didn't take long for Brad to try spinning the whole damn thing back into his favor, like he always did, always had, and probably always would if someone didn't stop him cold. 2 days after the call from my lawyer, he showed up on my front porch with that cheap confidence smeared across his face like cologne he'd borrowed from someone richer. He brought a 6-pack of beer, something local and overpriced, probably picked out by the guy at the register who thought IPA meant intelligent, persuasive asshole, and said he just wanted to talk, man to man. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other in my pocket, my face like stone. Brad cleared his throat like he was about to launch into a TED Talk, then said something along the lines of how things might have gotten misinterpreted or too legal too fast, and how there's still a path forward here if we both just calm down. I let him ramble, let him do his little dance with words, all that circling and soft-shoeing that weak men do when they know they're standing on a minefield they themselves buried years ago. Finally, I raised a hand. Not high, just enough to stop the flow of bullshit. You're behind on 13 payments, I said, my voice calm but carved from stone. You signed the papers. You had chances to make it right. You didn't. You gambled with something that wasn't yours to lose. Brad's grin cracked, but not all at once. It splintered in layers, like someone slowly peeling back wallpaper to find mold underneath. He stepped in closer, like proximity would soften me. Look, David, we're family. I know I screwed up. But let's be honest, this isn't about the money. This is about pride. About control. You want me to crawl. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. No, Brad. I want you to remember who paid for your wings before you started flapping around like you built the sky. Then I closed the door in his face. Not hard. Not loud. Just enough to tell him the conversation was over. That same evening, Angela came over alone. Her hair was pulled back like it used to be when she was in college, no makeup, eyes tired but alert, like she hadn't slept but wasn't letting herself crash just yet. She didn't hug me. She didn't sit. She just stood in the middle of the living room and asked, straight out, "Are you really going to take our house?" I paused because the question wasn't as simple as it sounded. I'd never wanted the house. I'd built it, sure, over months of sweat, weekends sacrificed, blueprints drafted in pencil and revised by hand. But I built it for them, not for me. The walls weren't mine. The laughter and the quiet fights and the silence afterward belonged to them. And yet, Brad had made it mine again when he offered it up as collateral, thinking I wouldn't ever call his bluff. I was useless, remember? I said, and she flinched like the word had sharp corners. That's what your husband said. That's what everyone laughed at. Angela's voice cracked. I didn't laugh. No, I said. But you didn't stop him either. She looked down, swallowing something hard. Then she asked, Are you trying to hurt us? It wasn't Angela's voice, it was Carol's, coming from behind me, from the hallway where I hadn't noticed her standing. She looked older than she had a week ago. More lines. More weight behind the eyes. I turned to face her, but I didn't soften. No, I said. I'm just finally telling the truth. Neither of them understood at first. But they would. I walked to the study and came back with a manila envelope. Not the same one from before. This one was newer, and inside it was something I'd kept hidden not for legal reasons, but for personal ones. I handed it to Angela and waited as she opened it, unfolding 3 printed screenshots. Messages. Late-night texts. A few images. One of them showed Brad, shirtless, smiling, lying in someone else's bed. Her name was Alyssa. She worked the front desk at that co-working space he pretended to have a membership to. Angela stared, frozen in a silence that made the room colder than I'd ever felt it. I found out 6 months ago, I said, my voice low but firm. Didn't say anything. Didn't want to hurt you. Figured it was his mess to fix. But now that everything's out in the open, well, I figure the rest of the truth deserves to live in daylight too. Angela sat down hard, the kind of sit that doesn't ask permission. She didn't cry. Not then. Just stared at the papers like they were a new language she had to translate before she could feel anything at all. Carol stepped forward, looking at me with something close to sorrow but not quite pity. You could have told her sooner, she said. I could have, I agreed. But I was trying not to destroy what little piece you had left. And now? Carol asked. Now, I said, turning to Angela, you get to decide. Angela blinked, slowly, deliberately. Decide what? I stepped closer, handed her a second envelope, this one sealed and heavy with more than just paper. You keep the house, I said, or you keep him. But not both. And then I walked away. Not out of cruelty, but because I trusted her to make the right call. Or, at the very least, the final one. The divorce papers were served on a gray Monday morning, the kind that smells like stale rain and cold coffee, and Brad didn't even pretend to be surprised when the process server said his name. He was staying in the unfinished basement of his old college buddy Mark's house, a guy who still had a beer pong table and thought being 38 meant finally learning how to use a crockpot. The place smelled like mildew and sweat, and Brad's only privacy came from a hanging curtain made from an old bed sheet. Angela didn't send a message, didn't call, didn't flinch. The envelope said everything she needed it to. A week later, the house was quiet again. No Brad, no tension, just space, wide and still. I pulled into the driveway like I had hundreds of times before, except this time I parked without that familiar weight sitting on my chest. I walked through the front door, where Angela stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, holding a mug of tea like it was a lifeline. She looked better. Not happy, not whole, but better. More herself than I'd seen in years. I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner, she said, her voice steady even as her fingers trembled. You didn't need to believe me, I replied. You just needed to see the truth for yourself. I reached into my coat and pulled out a document, clean, concise, notarized just that morning. She took it, read the top line, and blinked. This is a deed transfer. I nodded, watching her face closely. Technically, it's more of a confirmation. I put the house into a trust 15 years ago, after Brad proposed. You were the beneficiary then, and you still are now. He never owned a damn inch of it. Angela's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked like someone watching a magic trick they didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. He thought it was his. I almost smiled. Brad thinks a lot of things that aren't true. I turned to leave, but she stopped me. Why didn't you tell me sooner? There was a beat of silence so full it felt like thunder. I looked back at her and answered honestly. Because you needed to figure out what he was, not what I thought he was. And because sometimes protecting someone means letting them fall hard enough to wake up. Later that day, I sat in a corner booth at Marla's Diner, a place that hadn't changed since the early 90s, cracked vinyl booths, sticky syrup bottles, and the same waitress who still called everyone Han whether she meant it or not. Gina was already there, hair shorter than I remembered, jacket draped over the seat beside her, expression unreadable. It had been 5 years since we spoke. 5 years since she stormed out after a family dinner and said she was done playing the good daughter in a house that never made space for her truth. She didn't stand up, didn't smile, just said, "You got something to say, old man?" I slid into the booth, laid a folder on the table, and pushed it across without a word. She looked at it for a second, then flipped it open. Her eyes narrowed as she read through the pages. "This is the trust?" "It always had your name on it, too," I said, sipping my coffee. "Angela was the active beneficiary. You were the contingent. I updated it yesterday. You're both equal now." She raised an eyebrow, not impressed. "Why now?" I met her stare and didn't blink. Because I finally remembered what it means to act like a father, not just feel like one. I screwed up. I chose peace over honesty, and it made things worse. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't leave, either. She folded the papers and slipped them into her bag. "I'm not coming back for holidays or playing happy family for your guilt trip," she said flatly. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. She nodded once. Just once. And in that one gesture was more forgiveness than I deserved. Carol left 2 days later. She didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't make it dramatic. Just packed a bag, left a note that said, "You're not the man I married, but you are finally being honest. I need time to figure out who I am without this house, without all this silence." And that was it. 40 years, folded down to a page and a key left on the counter. I didn't chase her. I didn't argue. I just stood in the kitchen and stared at the spot where she'd stood when we brought Angela home from the hospital. That memory, like most things, was heavier now. That night, I went into the garage, my real sanctuary, and cracked open a beer. I didn't bother with a glass. I sat on the old stool by the workbench, surrounded by tools that hadn't seen action in months, maybe years. My fingers traced the dust on the edge of the bench like it was braille. Then I reached under the counter and pulled out the box I'd kept sealed for too long. A small box. Heavy. Labeled with permanent marker in my own handwriting. Phase 2. Inside, blueprints. Business plans. A registered LLC. A tech-adjacent startup idea I'd been slowly building in secret, using all the knowledge from years watching idiots like Brad fail and knowing exactly where they went wrong. It was real, it was sharp, and it was mine. They thought I was done. They thought I was some old man with a quiet grudge and too much time. But I was never after revenge for its own sake. I just wanted them to see what they turned their backs on. They laughed at a man they thought was done. I didn't laugh back. I planned. And I'm just getting started.